fast-moving wildfire.
In a word, it was devastating.
Tens of thousands of people are ordered to evacuate their California homes. Caught in the crossfire, new images of a Syrian boy injured in an airstrike spark outrage across the world. Continuing legal battle. Pittsburgh's bishop describes pressure from the federal government conflicting with a Supreme Court ruling. And truth or fabrication. A Rio police official claims an American Olympic star made up a story about being robbed at gunpoint. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, August 18th, 2016.
The thing we noticed was then we had a wall of flames about 25 foot high, and you could feel the heat.
Homeowners evacuate to escape a ferocious wildfire burning east of Los Angeles. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. The numbers are staggering. More than 82,000 people are under evacuation orders from 34,000 homes. 1,500 firefighters are trying to save their homes from destruction.
In my 40 years of fighting fire, I've never seen fire behavior so extreme.
Extreme and uncontrolled, a roaring fire burns everything in its path. Hot, windy weather and dry brush only help the fire spread.
It's challenging when we're up against a fire that's burning so aggressively that we're really struggling to keep up with it.
The Blue Cut Fire is about 70 miles east of Los Angeles. You can see the flames light up the night sky in this time-lapse video. Watch as the fire grows.
With the rate of spread that we've seen, if we ask you to leave, you have to leave.
The fire started Tuesday morning, engulfing mountains in plumes of smoke. Crews say the explosive and fast-moving flames make fighting this fire really dangerous.
This is a challenging year. One of the things that we're seeing is that the fires are burning in a really unprecedented fashion. It's to the point where explosive fire growth is the new normal this year, and that's a challenge for all of us to take on.
And unprecedented flooding continues to plague southern Louisiana. Tens of thousands of people are affected.
I cry for her and her kids, because maybe that's where they grew up. That's where they were born and they were raised in.
Len Mathern watches his wife Doris trudge through a flooded street to check on the house where she's lived most of her life.
We've been here 56, 57 years. But there's so many people that are so much worse off that I can't complain about anything.
Torrential rains caused catastrophic flooding, killing at least 11 people, damaging 40,000 homes. Rescue groups are working to reunite hundreds of pets with their homeowners. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson visits Baton Rouge this afternoon. He promises the federal government will be there as long as it takes to help the community recover. Johnson says President Obama, vacationing in New England, is getting daily briefings on the situation in Louisiana. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Brazilian police claim American swimmer Ryan Lochte lied about being robbed at gunpoint in Rio de Janeiro. Police now tell a very different story. They say the 4 American Olympic swimmers vandalized the restroom at a suburban Rio gas station early Sunday morning. Police released security video showing the incident. 2 armed security guards reportedly confronted the Americans with guns drawn. The manager demanded that they pay for the damage, which they eventually did. Lochte had originally claimed that he and his teammates were robbed at gunpoint after their taxi was pulled over by men showing a police badge. The U.S. State Department now admits the $400 million cash payment to Iran in January was contingent on the release of American prisoners. The Obama administration insists the cash, airlifted to Iran on pallets, was not a ransom payment. The administration's position is that it came from Iran's assets that had been frozen in the late 1970s. It says Iran was pursuing the return of those assets through an international tribunal. This puts a new face on Syria's bloody civil war. Haunting video, and we warn you, some of it very graphic. Images of a boy rescued after an airstrike in Aleppo are going viral. This leads to calls from around the world for an end to the violence. Wyatt Goolsby reports.
He's being called the boy in the ambulance. He doesn't cry or speak. He just looks stunned. Chaos surrounding him. Syrian activists opposed to President Bashar Assad released this video, which has since gone viral. It shows 5-year-old Omran and his 3 siblings being rescued after an airstrike in Aleppo. The boy and his family survived. but an hour after this rescue, their home collapsed. Aleppo is now the focal point of Syria's civil war. Half of the city is controlled by the government, half by rebels. The situation is so bad, the United Nations envoy says no humanitarian aid in the last month has reached the people who need it.
We ask for at least a pause of 48 hours. We insist on this.
The U.S. says Russia is adding more fuel to the fire. For the first time ever, Moscow is using Iranian bases to launch airstrikes into Syria.
Fundamentally, this isn't helpful. And it's not helpful because, it continues to complicate what is already a very dangerous situation in and around Aleppo.
Activists in Aleppo cannot confirm if Russia is responsible for last night's airstrike, but the video and pictures of the aftermath highlight the horrific toll of the civil war, which has now lasted more than 5 years. Top American and Russian diplomats plan to meet next week in another effort to stop Syria's civil war. They hope to forge a partnership against mutual enemies, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Brian?
Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. Turning now to politics, Donald Trump's new campaign manager speaks out. Kellyanne Conway says Trump is focusing on the issues and the election will come down to a debate about substance.
I would tell him to stick to the issues because this campaign will be won on the issues. And the issue set very much favors Donald Trump.
Conway is just one new member of Trump's leadership team. Steve Bannon from Breitbart News, the campaign's new CEO, is described as a hard-driving perfectionist. The Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh believes the government is violating a Supreme Court order. It's still fighting to keep the Obamacare contraceptive mandate from superseding religious freedom. Pittsburgh's Bishop David Zubik, the lead plaintiff in Zubik versus Burwell, that's the lawsuit challenging the contraceptive mandate. Your Excellency, the most recent Supreme Court action seemed to legally protect your diocese. What has happened since that ruling?
Well, first of all, Brian, it's good to be with you and your viewers. I want to say that what we know for sure is that the Supreme Court in May encouraged both sides, not only encouraged, but really expected both sides to sit down at a table to work out the question so that both sides could get what they want, namely that our concerns for religious freedom would find religious freedom continue to be protected and the government would be able to get its way in terms of what it was looking for with the Affordable Health Care Act, but not infringing on our religious freedom. Part of what has happened is that the government has been very slow in establishing the time to be able to sit down to work through the discussion on the level of the circuit courts of appeal. But what we've become aware of over the course of the last couple of weeks is that the government has now gone to third-party providers saying, you're going to start providing these services for the people who work for all the various entities, including religious ones. And we're saying, wait a minute, where's this coming from? Because in reality, the Supreme Court said the discussion has to take place. The solution can, in fact, be worked out. And now we're finding that the government apparently has decided to skip beyond that to try to give instructions. And so I think our lawyers are challenging the intent of the government on that particular issue, that action.
Very briefly, what has it been like for you and your diocese to be at the center of this controversy?
Well, I think it's not just us. I think everybody else who's joined in with us in this effort, including the Little Sisters of the Poor. It is a matter of doing the right thing. It's a matter of defending the whole matter of religious freedom. I think many people will try to narrow the issue around contraception or abortifacients, but the issue is much broader than that. That's the presenting issue. The big issue is that we need to be able to exercise our religious freedom. It's a right that's been given us by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has basically said that we don't have to comply while this discussion is going on, that there won't be any penalties placed on us, and we just want to make sure that everything the Supreme Court has in fact indicated by its expectation of us, the plaintiffs as well as the government, that we really follow along with what the Supreme Court's asking of us.
Bishop David Zubik, the Diocese of Pittsburgh, Your Excellency, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, a priest from Caritas visits the U.S. seeking help for Ebola orphans. And Vatican meeting, we have more insight into the Pope's visit with the French president this week. We appreciate you joining us for EWTN News Nightly this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The Catholic Church continues to help children orphaned by the worst Ebola outbreak ever. That epidemic killed more than 11,000 people in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone in West Africa. Jason Calvi reports.
These kids have no mom, no dad. The United Nations estimates 23,000 children lost their parents or primary caregivers in the Ebola crisis. Father Peter Conti of Caritas Freetown says they still fight stigmas, fears the victims could be carrying the deadly virus.
They are looking again to be loved. And so that's one of our missions, is to restore love and smile to these kids by giving them an atmosphere that they will feel loved and cherished.
Caritas is bringing smiles to about 400 orphans. 40 in this orphanage, and the rest living in foster care or with extended families. And they're training students to help other students, what Father Peter calls joy clubs.
They just share joy, joke, and see that the others are smiling. They look for kids who particularly are withdrawn, and then they want to listen to their story and tell them they themselves were in the same situation, but now they have overgone that and they are smiling.
Ebola is no longer front page news, and Sierra Leone is now Ebola free. But Father Peter has made the 4,000+ mile journey to the United States, and here at the U.S. Capitol, he's bringing a simple message.
We should not be forgotten, and in fact, there is vital need now to support us.
Father Conti and partners from the Healy Foundation are here to thank Americans for their support during the initial crisis and ask for more help so they can set up medical clinics to stop future outbreaks.
I want to take the opportunity to thank the audience of EWTN for their support during the Ebola crisis. It was really in great measure thanks to their help and their support that we were able to support close to 400 orphans.
Mom and dad are gone, but smiles are returning once again. Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Jason. And the Vatican isn't saying what Pope Francis and French President François Hollande discussed during their 40-minute visit Wednesday. Marie Duhamel with Vatican Radio's French section joining us from Rome. How is President Hollande's visit with Pope Francis being reviewed there in France?
Obviously, it was one of the top headlines yesterday in France. I think some newspapers thought it was a way for the president to get some votes, the Catholic votes, but the main thing, the truth is that in France, after the death of Father Hamel, French people were under shock. They were just terribly sad. And the fact that the bishops, the answer of the bishop to that evil act was such... for French people, it was wonderful. It was a way to get hope. The answer was obviously love and forgiveness and not revenge. And I thought it was really good for, it gave a sense of peace and also a really strong national unity. And then Hollande has no choice. He went to the Vatican to thank the Pope for that answer and the fact that that answer was a blessing for France.
And what is the Archbishop of Lyon, Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, saying about that visit?
He told me that it was a very simple visit. It was an act of brotherhood, of solidarity after what France went through, and especially after the death of Father Hamel. And in France, we have what we call the laïcité. And the laïcité means that every person has a right to be Jew, Catholics, to believe in its religion. But it's also true that we have some prejudice towards Christians, that we have some shame towards Jew, and obviously some fears towards Muslims. And we have to go beyond that. That's what he told me.
Marie Duhamel joining us from the Vatican, Vatican Radio correspondent joining us from Rome. Thank you, Marie. And migrants from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are trying new routes to get into the United States. Reuters reports the Department of Homeland Security will work closely with Latin American countries to tackle this new phenomenon. More than 6,300 Asian, African, and Middle Eastern migrants tried entering Mexico in the first 6 months of this year. That is up from 4,200 in all of 2015 There were fewer than 2,000 in 2014. Teresa Brown, formerly with the Homeland Security Department, now directs immigration policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. What do you read from these numbers, Teresa, and how many of them actually get into the U.S.?
Well, it is a relatively new phenomenon that we're seeing an increase in non-Mexican and non-South Latin American migrants coming through our southern border. It probably means that the criminal organizations that help smuggle these people are finding new markets. But it is a little bit of a concern because we have to treat immigrants that come to our borders from other than Mexico differently in our system, and that puts pressure on how we manage our system.
So people who enter from Mexico can fairly easily be sent back across the border.
Right.
Not the case with these immigrants, right?
Not the case with these immigrants, same as the Central American immigrants that we've seen coming in the last few years. Mexico won't take back people who aren't from Mexico. So if they're apprehended at our Mexican border, our Department of Homeland Security people have to detain them. They are interviewed to see if they have a fear of returning to their country. And even if they are found removable later through a court process, they still have to arrange for travel documents and flights and things like that. So it creates stress on the system when we have higher numbers.
And I'm sure that unaccompanied minors also puts more stress on the immigration court system.
Yeah, the unaccompanied minors have an even different process. They are automatically referred to an immigration judge and an immigration court to allow their cases to be heard. They are released to family members or other relatives in the United States. Health and Human Services is responsible for their care until their court cases can be heard. An awful lot of them are asking to apply under a special immigrant visa that allows kids who have been abandoned or are not with their parents to stay. That system is now backlogged as well. So we have a huge problem dealing with these.
It's a mess. Do you think this is a threat to our national security, this new trend?
Well, so far there's no evidence that these other than Mexican migrants are related to terrorism or criminality. That's one of the things obviously we would look for. Right. But you know, people are a little concerned, and we do have to be careful that we are screening people appropriately as they're apprehended.
Teresa Brown with the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's so good to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, we look at a growing trend, why fewer American women are having babies and what it means for our future, and one man's unusual journey.
You end up being alone with yourself, a goat, and God.
Mark Irons tells us why he's walking across the country with a goat. Thanks for joining us this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The U.S. fertility rate falls to its lowest point on record, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In the first quarter of this year, there were just under 60 babies born for every 1,000 women ages 15 to 44. That's roughly half the recorded rate at the peak of the 1950s baby boom. Population Research Institute President Stephen Mosier and Jeannie Mancini, president of the March for Life, are with us tonight. Stephen, what do you see is behind this trend?
Well, I think it's primarily due to the Great Recession that we've been in for the last 8 years. It has cost us, by the way, about 3 million births, children who were not conceived and, of course, were not born because their parents were worried about their finances, about their future. 25% of young couples who are married are postponing having children right now because they don't feel they can afford them. And another 20% of young people are not getting married at all because, again, they feel financially unable to do so. They're not able to get a good job. They're living at home with their parents. And what we're seeing is a reprise of the Great Depression. What happened during the Great Depression was a quarter of women did not ever have children. They married late in life and remained childless.
I was a baby boomer, one of 10. Does our society, our culture today, Jeannie, discourage women from having children?
You know, I think that there are some really confusing messages to women, and especially with regard to children. There's this idea that a child is a commodity, and, you know, we see delaying childhood, plan exactly when it's going to happen, and when it doesn't work out exactly as you wanted, then use in vitro or use different, like, mechanisms because it's more of a commodity than a gift. There's this terrible thing happening right now called Shout Your Abortion. And it's horrific, and it's this idea, if it doesn't fit with the plans, then go ahead and get an abortion, and let's try to destigmatize, you know, this terrible, awful thing. In fact, we just saw Cecile Richards, the president of Planned Parenthood, come out and explained in her sort of Shout Your Abortion story that they decided 3 was enough, so they terminated number 4. The truth is that every life is a gift and it's a miracle, and we have to see life as a gift. It's not a commodity. It's not something to be manipulated, so to speak. It's a gift.
And there's a very practical side. Stephen, you have researched China's population control extensively. What happens when the population growth of a nation continually declines?
Well, I think you can see something of a death spiral developing, right? The birth rate goes down. In China's case, it was forced down. And then you see economic growth slowing. And as a result of slower economic growth, you see the birth rate going down ever further. So it's kind of puts you into a death spiral. Right now, China is losing part of its workforce each year. They have 4 million fewer workers in the workforce this year than they had last year. The labor pool is going to be shrinking from now on. Now in China, what they have done is they moved from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. And if that doesn't boost the birth rate enough so they get enough workers, they will force women to conceive and bear children, I have no doubt. In the U.S., we have young women who want to have, on average, 2.5 children. We just have to make it possible for them to marry, find a life partner, and encourage that natural impulse to be generous in welcoming children from God.
Stephen Mosier with the Population Research Institute, Jeannie Mancini, Right to Life or March for Life. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, Uber plans to use self-driving cars on the streets of Pittsburgh in the next several weeks. The company says the autonomous Ford Fusions will have human backup drivers. Uber has a self-driving research lab in Pittsburgh and is working on autonomous technology. That ride-sharing company is also acquiring a startup that's developing technology to allow big rigs to drive themselves. Uber's CEO says the future of transportation is driverless. Finally tonight, a story illustrating God truly works in mysterious ways. After his dog was injured, a Washington state man chooses an unusual companion for a spiritual mission. As Mark Irons reports, this animal is a godsend.
When his best friend opened a Christian orphanage in Africa, Steve Westcott wanted to help. So the unconventional heavy metal musician turned in his guitar for a goat and took a long walk of faith.
Everybody in the beginning was like, this is craziness.
Westcott is trekking with his goat Miles from the Space Needle in Seattle, Washington to Times Square in New York City. Miles draws a big crowd. Steve does the talking, and thousands of people are learning about Uzima Outreach. The ministry helps drug addicts and neglected children in Nairobi, Kenya. This journey is paying off.
It's just like God to take a guy and a goat to raise $100,000 for orphans in Africa.
Halfway to a goal of $200,000, Steve says Miles carries the biggest load.
The goat has been the most important piece because it's the only reason people even talk to me. Seattle to New York. Without that goat, I'm just a guy walking down the road with a backpack.
The two travelers can get up to 8 miles a day, average speed 1 mile per hour. Of course, you have to factor in pit stops to graze. It's taken over 4 years to walk from Seattle to D.C., but speed isn't the goal. Steve stops the walk in winter for speaking engagements. Miles recharges and continues eating.
It's like a buffet across America.
Sometimes a fellow walker joins the two, but most of the time,
you end up being alone with yourself, a goat, and God. When I've been out in the middle of the desert and I'm just wanting to give up and I'm hating the project, you'll hear that little whisper from the Holy Spirit that says, the kids are eating. The kids are in school. They're not in the streets. And I know the Lord as the comforter because that brings comfort.
Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Mark. Miles, what a great name for the goat. He earned it. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick, and we leave you tonight looking back at Sunday's huge Catholic celebration in Bolivia. Thousands of dancers joined a procession devoted to the Virgin of Urquipina. Good night. God bless.
Ay, cuánto dolor por su amor.